Imagine this scene. A man is falsely accused of a capital offense. Now, to the shock and distress of his family and friends, he's convicted on the basis of false testimony. Now, we say they're shocked and they're distressed because the testimony came from men who were known to be untrustworthy, irresponsible. These men were liars. Now, a sick feeling overwhelms lovers of justice as they witness the execution of that innocent man and his sons. Now, this is not an imaginary account, but it is the real experience of a faithful servant of Jehovah named Naboth. He lived during the time of wicked King Ahab of Israel. So it's obvious in this case that what was clearly absent was justice. But just what is justice? Well, from a human standpoint, justice is often understood to be nothing more than the fair application of the rules of law. But justice, as used in the Bible, basically means to do what God considers to be right and to do so without partiality. Here's a fact. Justice is not a prevailing quality in the world today. Any one of us could become victims of unjust acts at all levels of society. It could happen at your place of work. It could happen in school. It can happen in our dealings with officials. And in other words, it could even happen in our own families. Of course, injustices are not new. Mankind has a long history of injustice. I want you to follow along with me with what was said some nearly over 3,000 years ago in the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 4. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 1, just so that we can accent this point, that justice or injustice has a long history in mankind's existence. Note what's stated in verse 1. There it says, again, I turned my attention to all the acts of oppression that go on under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and there was no one to comfort them. And their oppressors had the power, and there was no one to comfort them. Later in this same Bible book, in chapter 8, verse 9, a comment is made that man dominates man to his harm. So what happens when we continue to experience these acts that are not fair, these acts that put us in a position where we feel helpless? Well, when people feel dissatisfied with certain actions of government or other social systems, and they feel that these systems are rigged in favor of a select few, you know what people will do eventually? They move from resignation to a belief that they have to do something. So in other words, the existence of injustice has moved people to take up this, put themselves in a position rather, where they will fight against the thing that's causing the oppression. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever been victimized by injustice? At that time, didn't you want relief of some sort? But you ever wonder why we react so strongly when we become victims of unfair treatment? Well, simply put, because we were made in God's image. It's inborn, this sense of justice. Remember, injustice is diametrically opposed to all that Jehovah stands for. So whenever a person's being mistreated, it's only natural to want relief from oppression. We often see evidence of this desire for relief. It manifests itself in protests. Now, words associated with protests today are rebellion, revolt, uprising, and insurrection. Those are the words that are often associated with protests. But what does the face of protest look like today? Well, take a look at our opening image here. Our opening image, this is the face of protests today. Many take justice into their own hands. And they do this because they feel that their efforts somehow could change the world. Protest has been a powerful weapon for change in the past. For example, I'm just going to cite some examples of protests, a few protests, because there are too many to count in mankind's history. Let's go back just a few hundred years. In the 16th century, we had the Protestant Reformation. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party. In 1789, there was the storming of the Bastille, and this was done as a result of inequalities. In 1930, we had Gandhi's Salt March, and this was a protest against British taxation. In 1963, there was the March on Washington. And that march was to promote racial equality and draw up firm civil rights legislation. In 2003, there was the Iraq war protests, where millions in cities around the world gathered to protest. In 2017, we had the Women's March on Washington. This is, to date, the single day largest protest in U.S. history. And then also in the same year after, in March 2018, we were horrified, weren't we, when we heard about the 17 people who were killed at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. As a result, surviving students organized a march on Washington, or in Washington, where some 800,000 people joined that protest. And of course, just this year, we have the George Floyd protests, where thousands of people in all 50 states have come together. Now, we mentioned these examples of protests, and in some cases, we have to acknowledge that they brought about some change. It did. There were changes. But the fact that we have to continue having protests is an indication that somehow they're not accomplishing their intended goal to end injustice. But why? Why are protests or acts of rebellion really not the answer to injustice? Because it doesn't correct the root cause of it. At Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 15, it says, what is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot possibly be counted. What's the point? Well, throughout centuries, men have sincerely tried to solve problems and to better people's life, but nothing has worked. No matter how powerful, rich, or influential a person may be, he's still a human and cannot eliminate injustice. For that fact, even powerful people suffer injustices. They grow old and they die. Justice in this world is elusive. So for those who have spent their lifetime seeking it, they can become consumed with bitterness and resentment when their expectations are not realized. 31 years ago, the Prime Minister of Australia set the goal that by 1990, no Australian child would be living in poverty. Well, we know that never happened. That Prime Minister later regretted having fixed that objective. So what's the problem? What's the root cause? We still have to identify that. The root cause is that injustice will continue because people are not following God's just in righteous ways. That's right. Jehovah has moral standards. Without those standards being applied, there could be no way of determining or judging good and bad. Jehovah provides guidelines that help us to know what he views as right and wrong. They also help us with our own attitude. That's right. Jehovah's standards help us be loving. It helps us make good decisions, and it teaches us how to be kind to others. While the world standards continue to get lower, Jehovah's standards do not change. And because they don't change, we have a measure for establishing justice. So again, any attempt by men to bring about true justice apart from Jehovah, apart from God, are doomed to fail. Any judicial system can only be as just and as dependable as the people who design and administer it. People are prone to error. They're prone to dishonesty. They're prone to prejudice. So in this world, any effort to establish a just system will reflect the same flaws. A popular saying that was coined during the civil rights era of this country was that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So our question now is, who's going to correct the problem anywhere so that it is removed everywhere? Well, simply put, God. That's right. Jehovah has the solution to injustice. What is that solution? Well, the solution is the kingdom or government that he's established to bring complete justice. That kingdom will soon replace every human government, and it will rule the entire earth. Now, Jehovah has done something remarkable. He's placed as ruler of that kingdom his son, Jesus Christ. Now, we've learned a lot about people who run for political office. Men and women who've put themselves out to be of assistance to others. In some respects, they're to be applauded for their noble efforts. But they fail because they're incapable of solving many of their own problems. It can be somewhat presumptuous trying to solve someone else's problems when you can't even solve your own. But what do we know about Jesus? What does his resume tell us that gives us confidence that he's the ruler that we want? Well, I want you to note the credentials that Jesus, he has, and that are clearly documented, well established, and will never be erased from God's word. Turn with me to Isaiah chapter 9. Isaiah chapter 9. And we're going to read verses 6 and 7. And you just tell me, is this what you would be looking for in a leader and someone who's going to help you? So Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6 and 7, it says, "For a child has been born to us, a son has been given to us, and the rulership will rest on his shoulder. His name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. To the increase of his rulership and to peace, there will be no end." That clearly indicates that injustice has to be removed, correct? But let's continue reading. It says, on the throne of David and on his kingdom, on the throne of David and on his kingdom, in order to establish firmly and to sustain it through justice and righteousness from now on and forever, the zeal of Jehovah of armies will do this. So what do you see here? What makes Jesus such a good ruler? It's the person that he proved to be. a wonderful counselor, a mighty God, an eternal Father, a Prince of Peace, establishing justice and righteousness. He's the needed ruler we've always needed. When Jesus was on earth, we could put our confidence in him. We would have been able to do that. Why? Because he hated lawlessness. Jesus hated injustice. Now, he did everything that he could to make a person's life better than what it was. Now, it's true that Jesus didn't go around promoting social or political reforms. And there's a reason he did that. When you think about it, during the time that Jesus lived, there were some reformers who lived during the long history of the Roman Empire. Some may have been familiar with Jesus, and maybe they even accomplished some good. But usually their work was changed after they died. And we know at the very latest, whatever they accomplished disappeared when the Roman Empire itself fell. So imagine if Jesus had promoted social or political reform, what would have happened? Well, it would have lasted only as long as the Roman Empire lasted. So why didn't Jesus promote social or political reforms? Because Jesus knew that you cannot reform a system that will soon be destroyed. Jesus knew that. So what did he promote? He taught people God's kingdom. He encouraged them to give that consideration. It was good news, this kingdom, and what it would do. Jesus taught his followers to keep the kingdom before themselves by praying for it. So God's kingdom is the answer to injustice. But Jesus did something else. Besides just talking about the kingdom, he showed what the kingdom could do. Jesus performed amazing miracles, and those miracles will be associated with God's government in the future. Now, there are many national rulers today, and they have noble goals. But most national rulers have medical teams, don't they, with them? So we got rulers of government today. They have medical teams that they're associated with, but none could ever accomplish what Jesus did here on the earth with his miracles. You see, Jesus didn't travel with a medical team. Jesus is the ruler that we need. But what else will the kingdom do? Well, I want you to take a look at our second image. Our second image here gives us this image here certainly doesn't represent the world we live in today. We know the world we live in is divided. But why is it divided? Because of prejudice, because of abuse, because of oppression. But these are the things that God's kingdom will eliminate. In the book of Psalms, the 72nd Psalm, verses 12 through 14, it tells us that Jehovah will rescue the poor who cry for help. Certainly being rescued would contribute to the smiles we see in this image. It says that he, the lowly one, and whoever has no helper will be comforted. That would contribute to these smiles. It says that he will have pity on the lowly ones and the poor, and he will save them. Now, granted, with our imperfect minds, it's hard to imagine how wonderful the new world will be under God's kingdom. I mean, we're talking about badness not existing anymore, every day being a great day. But that's exactly what the kingdom will do. Jehovah will correct everything that's wrong with it. And he's going to make this correction in a way that will exceed any expectation that we may have. But there's more. God's kingdom is going to eliminate economic injustice. You know, in many lands, the rich minority keeps getting richer, while the poor, they face economic injustices. So we know for a fact that the millions are devastated by poverty. They're devastated by hunger and disease. And what about medical procedures? In many wealthy lands, the wealthy benefit from advanced medical procedures. But one report says that half of the world lives on less than $2.50 a day. Their existence has been called cradle to grave injustice. So the kingdom has to eliminate economic injustice if we're going to escape the injustices of this world. It has to go. God's kingdom will do so. And what about the races and ethnicities? Isn't it amazing that people judge you based on the color of your skin or the place where you were born? Things that you have no control over are the things that have become big issues in the world today. But the Bible reminds us that God is not partial. He's going to treat all people with love, with kindness. They will all be recipients of the goodness of the kingdom. And that's something that's not happening in the world today. And what about your home? The homes it should be a retreat of peace. But for many, it's not that way. They suffer injustices even in their own homes. Well, the Bible promises that God's kingdom will do away with the elements that create the problems or create problems within one's home. Well, that's great, isn't it? Isn't it good to hear that God's kingdom, that Jehovah has enough interest in mankind, that he's established a kingdom that will soon exercise authority over the entire earth. And that comforts us. But how does that help us deal with injustices that exist today? You see, until God's kingdom comes and corrects the chaos that's caused by injustice, we're going to have to learn to live or cope with it. So how can we cope with injustice now without losing our minds? What can we do? Well, we're just going to consider a few steps that we can take. Number one, I want you to look with me at Proverbs chapter 22. Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 3. Proverbs 22, verse 3. And remember, our focus is on what we can do to cope or live with injustices. So Proverbs 22:3 says, "The shrewd one sees the danger and conceals himself, but the inexperienced keep right on going and suffer the consequences." Now, this scripture indicates two things that we might do to avoid situations where mistreatment is likely to occur. It says, one, you have to foresee dangerous situations and avoid them. And number two, you have to rehearse mentally how to handle difficult problems. Now, what do we know about people? What contributes to injustice? Well, some people make judgments based on how you look. We can't avoid that. Well, what did one father do? Well, one father recommended to his son. He knew the circumstances of the area where they lived, and he knew that his son was going to have dealings with law enforcement. So this is what he recommended. And this is just an example, one example that one father demonstrated in this matter of shrewdness. So he told his son, he says, when you get your driver's license and you take your photo ID, I want you to wear a white or neutral color shirt and a tie. Why? Well, he knew that if his son's license was pulled, the image that was observed could have an impact on law enforcement. Now, we're not saying you should do that, but this is what one father did. He also told his son, speak with respect. I can remember personally growing up, grew up in Miami, Florida, and my mother and father always stressed to me, my brothers and sisters, avoid crowds. Whenever you see a crowd assembling, and they knew that kids, whenever they saw crowds, they would try to rush towards those crowds. But anyway, they says, whenever you see a crowd forming on the streets, avoid it. Why? He says they can escalate into something that could be dangerous. Well, in May of 1980, an event erupted in Miami, Florida. And I felt that I needed to be a part of it. At that time, I didn't know Jehovah. I didn't know anything about his kingdom. I just thought that if something was an injustice took place or occurred, that I needed to do something about it. But it was the advice of my parents that protected me. Because a gathering that started off peaceful, it resulted in violence, and it became a full-blown out riot. In the end, 17 people were dead, 1,000 were arrested, and there were damages, physical damages of over $100 million. So what's the point? Well, simply put, there are times when we have to just foresee problems that will occur. Now, what's the second step that we might take if we're a victim of injustice? Well, seek help through the legal system. In many judicial systems, there are legal channels that will enable us to correct a situation. But what if that fails? Well, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6 and 7 tells us what to do. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5 and 6. Chapter 5, verse 6 and 7. There it says, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6 and 7, it says, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that he may exalt you in due time, while you throw all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. So what's the point? If we're denied justice, simply put, the only thing that we can do sometimes is pour our feelings out to Jehovah in prayer. You see, if we get angry and try to fight a personal injustice, we could easily overreact and we could make things worse. Remember, Jehovah is going to answer the problem of injustice. And here's one final thing that we can do. Develop qualities that can help you. Qualities such as patience, which will always help you put up with wrong and not quickly become angry. Kindness. Kind people are friendly people. And then self-control. Self-control will help you keep your mind in check, your speech in check, your action in check. We need those, don't we? These qualities, all of them, can help us remain calm when we face injustices and will help us avoid making matters worse. Remember what it was like when we were children? What would you do if your brother or sister shoved you? Well, we shove them back, right? That's tit for tat behavior. But you know, it's not limited to children. That's how many adults act in the world today. But the Bible tells us, return evil for evil to no one. In time, we can soften people who are oppressive. Well, what have we considered? Well, we don't live in a just world, right? 2, protests bring some relief, but it does not solve the problem of injustice. Our third point was that justice is missing because Jehovah's standards have not been accepted. And fourth, we have to learn Jehovah's standards and live by them in this unjust world. So the question is, will we ever see true justice? Absolutely. Without question, it's coming. Jehovah will destroy this unjust system of things that's under Satan's control. He will bring in a new world. It will be controlled by his heavenly kingdom. But until it comes, build your faith in God's kingdom, which promises to end all wickedness and to bring what our hearts truly desire, justice. So whatever you're dealing with, however difficult it may be, trust that Jehovah understands what you're going through. He will bring true justice that will bring the desired relief to you and those that you love.